trauma happens relationally. So as mammals, we're social creatures. So if we are experiencing trauma, there's a disconnect to a sense of belonging.
Hello and welcome to Self Talk. I'm your host, Rachel Astarte. Today, my guest is Greg Weiting. Greg helps you heal the anxiety, depression, chronic pain, and trauma you can't think or talk your way out of. We're going to talk a lot about that. Specifically, we're going to talk about intergenerational trauma. But first, I want to thank you, Greg, for being on Self Talk.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad. This is such an important topic, and it's sort of a buzz topic that a lot of people are talking about these days. So I think it's really important that we maybe break it down, this intergenerational trauma concept. But before we do that, tell the listeners, if you would, a little bit about who you are and how you got into doing what you do.
Sure. Yeah, I primarily am helping folks address the impacts of trauma that are creating all sorts of imbalance. Oftentimes chronic illness like anxiety, depression, chronic pain, really helping, address the pain that we can't often think or talk our way through. So what's stored in the body and creating inflammation that's impacting the immune system, that's dysregulating the nervous system. So being able to bypass the brain and really tap into the body's innate wisdom. A lot of folks really appreciate my orientation to healing because we're not really focused on trauma. We're not really focused on pain. My work is more committed to helping people realign to their innate wisdom. And if that concept, I think it first was developed in chiropractic decades ago. But ultimately, there's a healing mechanism within each of us. And that, when we get a paper cut, for example, it will send platelets and proteins and orchestrate all these biochemical transmissions to help us heal.
Right.
And that innate wisdom is working around the clock 24/7 without us having to think about it. And I look at healing as just helping us reconnect to that innate wisdom where we're that much more in alignment with the body's own organizational intelligence. And that's when we can really come back online. And when healing is a happening that we're not forcing, we're not efforting, it's not a mental process where we're figuring things out. It's a deeper symphony orchestra of body, mind, and spirit.
Beautifully said. I appreciate that because we're learning more and more that we need those three elements in alignment to really heal. It's not going to do if we're just working with the mind or just with the body or even just with the spirit, right? That this is all interconnected. So this innate healing aspect of our bodies, what gets it out of alignment?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think intergenerational trauma is certainly one piece, and just toxic stress, ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences. So, the more ACE scores we have, which can be abuse, violence, neglect, divorce, a parent who's incarcerated, substance abuse, the more we have these in early development, the greater a risk we are at for chronic illness. And so, all of those factors are going to flood the nervous system, and that's going to have us lose access to our upper brain of logic and reason, where we're defaulting to a survival brain, really just trying to figure out how to get through really adverse experiences, which keeps us on high alert. So all of those pieces have a big impact on the development of the brain, the function of the brain, and then the connection between, all the different parts of the body and brain, which when we're experiencing health are functioning like a symphony orchestra. But these imprints of trauma, adverse experience, and stress really start to short circuit the communication between all the different parts of the body and mind and spirit. And that's when we start to have the body start to communicate to us through symptoms, which then start to progress into illness.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And I think there's a gap for, that I've experienced. So let's back it up. You and I both have scoliosis. So this becomes a thing where, I was told, well, this is just physically how your body was made. Right. And as a result, or I'm finding over time, as a result, I have an ongoing spinal issue, which has manifested itself in my right iliopsoas. Right. It's really tight. It's very painful. It's been this way for 4 years. I've seen, chiropractors and osteopaths and acupuncturists and a shaman, you know what I mean? So all of these things. Is this kind of what you're talking about? Is this the kind of work that you do with people to figure out, like, how much of scoliosis is that's just how you were born, and that's why your spine is affected the way it is? How much of that is trauma versus just physiological damage?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think that's different for each individual. So yeah, my story with scoliosis, I'm actually 3 inches taller today than I was 25, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. I still have a pretty severe curve in my spine. So I still have scoliosis, and I don't think that's ever going to go away, but I also don't want to limit myself. Right. So I think so much of healing is honoring what is, and then how do we work with it more skillfully and with more awareness? Mm-hmm. My experience was that to kind of jump right into the topic of intergenerational trauma, I think we all come into the world, they say we come into the world as blank slates. And I just don't think that's true, because you put 2 newborns in front of the ocean, and one may be very drawn to the water and one may be really afraid of the water.
Right.
And so we all come in with these predispositions and also these generational patterns, and scoliosis being one of them. However, I look at those intergenerational patterns become it's kind of a weird imagery, but almost like the flypaper for things to stick onto. So if we come to the world with this intergenerational pattern, let's say scoliosis, that becomes a spot where patterns of trauma and adverse experience can latch onto and really aggravate. And so that's my experience. I look at that. We hold trauma in the connective tissue and fascia, and the connective tissue and fascia are what pull on the muscles and bones.
Right.
And so then our entire body starts to really become a posture or a costume of the patterns of wounding we may be carrying. That's much my lived experience. And so early on in my healing path, when I started to notice there were some shifts in my spine, it was, wow, how much of the adverse experiences that I had in early development latched onto the scoliosis and aggravated it and made it worse, And so then I was carrying this posture of guarding and protecting, and that the world is not safe and that everyone's out to get me. And I have to really shut down my heart and guard my heart. And so as a lot of that started to reorganize, how those patterns of trauma and that stagnation of emotion were stored in my tissues, that my spine had an opportunity to reorganize. And that's still a process. Those 3 inches, it wasn't an overnight process.
That's pretty significant. I wouldn't mind 3 extra inches, So, and you're saying this is done by working with the innate healing abilities of the body. So you're not necessarily therapizing intergenerational trauma. You're not looking, or are you? I don't know. How does that work in your practice?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, I don't work with talk therapy. How I'm working is I'm actually asking the body's innate wisdom how it would like to restore internal communication. So if the mind and spirit are the symphony orchestra, and trauma and stress short circuits the communication between all the parts, my job is just to ask the body's innate wisdom, where would you like to restore communication to help to break up some of the noise, to help each individual reconnect to their innate wisdom. So the symphony orchestra starts to come back online. And so that looks very different for each individual. And the difference here is we're so conditioned, especially with Western medicine, to treat symptoms. And then we're like, really that has us kind of like a dog chasing its own tail, because symptoms are just the tip of the iceberg. And what's underneath the surface is often a lot larger. And that's the many unique causative factors at play. So, for example, I had two identical twins who came in and they had a lot of the same diagnoses.
Wow.
They have the same genetics, they have the same environment, they have the same illnesses. But when I asked their bodies, innate wisdom, how it wants to reorganize, each of them had a very unique healing path, and each of them had very unique results that took them in different directions. So we're just helping people access their own organizational intelligence that's allowing them to live into the fulfillment of really their highest good. And each individual's highest good is unique, which is very different to the cookie cutter approaches to healthcare that are, you have this diagnosis and then we provide you this treatment, which is often a topical treatment that's not actually addressing causative factors.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also makes a lot of sense that, each human being has different innate healing abilities, because the twin example is such a great one, because you would think things would be similar if they grew up in the same house and they have the same, but yeah, that's the beautiful thing. We are still individuals in that regard, and receive the world around us in a different way. And so naturally the healing would be different for each person. Yeah. So let's break it down. Let's define what is intergenerational trauma. What would define that for you in your practice? What if somebody, I'm assuming that's part of what you're incorporating into the work that you're doing, is it might not just be this person experienced, it might be somebody's experienced childhood wounding, and therefore they're holding this tension in their body, the resulting inflammation is causing whatever their ailments are. But when we talk about intergenerational trauma, I think a lot of people get stumped, because it's like, well, I had a pretty good life. My parents were nice to me. I don't know why is my back messed up now, or why are my knees out of whack, or whatever it might be. It seems almost like this thing we can't control. So yeah, what do you think about that intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, well, and I think it's true. We can't control it. It's like we come into the world with these influences and with these imprints, but we do have a lot of choice in how we navigate and respond. And, my approach is very much one of following the body's innate wisdom instead of directing it. So as much as I can help clear up a lot of these imprints from intergenerational trauma, that's not my goal. It's often an outcome or a result of just helping people plug into their innate wisdom. Because if they're carrying this intergenerational wound that has, robbed them of some of their agency or taken away some of their resilience, and my job is just to help plug people into their agency and their resilience, it then affords the body, mind, and spirit, or the innate wisdom, the capacity to reorient or reconcile the imprints of these intergenerational patterns. And intergenerational patterns that can, very much be a hereditary illness. It can be a pattern of behaviors or beliefs. It could be something very structural. I worked with a family where, 3 generations, they all had a very similar physical posture, right? Wow. So you could just see through the generations how they are all carrying a very similar costume, right? So that costume and that posture then is also assuming different beliefs and behaviors. And these beliefs and behaviors get encoded from generation to generation. And, that could be partly through socialized trauma, right? So just the forces of, racism or sexism or homophobia or transphobia or, just all of these patterns that really make a mark on the individual and the collective, and how that gets passed on. And that really starts to, make its mark on each individual. And I think the gift of healing is that we can, start to intervene. So we're not passing on these patterns where we're starting to, I think so much of healing is metabolize and process and work through and integrate these imprints. So I think the essence of healing is just helping to neutralize the charge of these patterns. So then they no longer are carrying such a weight. And on the flip side of that, there's also ways that we can help to strengthen some of the intergenerational patterns that are that can be allies. There can be intergenerational resilience, there can be intergenerational innovation, there can be intergenerational patterns that we want to actually draw from. So how can we strengthen our connection to our ancestors in a way that fortifies our ability to heal?
Yeah, I appreciate that too. We do often look for what's broken and focus on that, as opposed to where are the strengths? How do we capitalize on those and work with those that might be there too? Because intergenerational trauma comes across, but I'm sure intergenerational resilience comes across as well. And so this may seem like an overly simple question, but I want people to get this because it's important. How does trauma affect us? How does it? So something bad happens. What actually happens to us in the body? Let's keep it specific to that, since that's what you work with. What happens when a trauma occurs?
Well, the imprint of trauma is going to impact the brain. There's a neurotoxicity to it, right? And so trauma is going to be any lived experience that has us felt isolated, unsupported, alone, alienated. So that's going to really short circuit our connection to wholeness. And so it creates this fragmentation or this split within us. So much of trauma happens relationally. So as mammals, we're social creatures. So if we are experiencing trauma, there's a disconnect to a sense of belonging, which is something that we really depend upon. And so the impact of that is losing access to upper logic and reason. And when we default to survival brain, that's going to be just this over adrenalized state of fight, flight, or the hypoarousal of freeze and appease. And many of us are just living in that nonstop. I mean, I'm just thinking right now, just the economic disparity of so many Americans living paycheck to paycheck. That is financial trauma that has people living in chronic 24/7 state of fear. That's going to that over adrenalized state. It's just has a wear and tear on the body. So trauma could be seen as too much too soon. Some experience that was just too overwhelming to fully metabolize and process, or too much for too long, which is a lot of complex trauma in early development, ongoing abuse or ongoing neglect, which then would be too little for too long. So not getting our developmental needs met. And that's the tricky one too. When people say, well, nothing bad happened to me, I don't have any trauma. Well, if we didn't have our developmental needs met reliably and consistently, then that's signaling that could be life or death, because in early development, we can't meet our own needs. So if they're not being met by our caregivers reliably and consistently, that can signal life or death as well. So that's more of the insidious piece of trauma. And I think complex trauma in early development, because we normalize it. So whether we're not getting our needs met or some bad things are happening in our environment, we often will then turn the arrow back at us and assume that, well, I'm not getting my needs met or something bad is happening to me. It's my fault.
Yes.
So then, on top of the fear, on top of the hypervigilance, on top of the alienation is shame and this identity of shame that I am bad. So unpacking that, is quite the journey. And it's possible. And so that's the gift of while the brain and the body and the nervous system can become damaged from trauma, it also has a remarkable capacity to heal.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had actually. Is it reversible? Is it healable? The other way to ask that question is, are there long-term physical effects of this work, or not doing this work? In other words, for example, if somebody has gone 15 years in chronic pain, and then they find you, is that too late? Have they done long-term damage to their nerves and their fascia and it's not reversible? Or is there ever a point where it's not, I don't want to say too late, but you know what I'm saying? Where it's like, I don't know, maybe I've like killed some nerve cells here and I just am not going to be okay again.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Rachel here. If you'd like to dive deeper into your own self-development, but you're looking for an alternative to traditional talk therapy, I think you'll love the Foundation of Self Immersion program. For a full year, you'll get dynamic coursework you can complete on your own time, plus weekly coaching calls and monthly one-on-one sessions with me for personal support. Visit foundationofself.com and click on the events page for more information. That's foundationofself.com. Now, back to the episode.
I'd say if you still have a pulse, it's too late. I think the body, when again it's given the right input and the right support, can respond remarkably well. And so again, because that innate wisdom, as long as we're alive, that innate wisdom is present. Mm-hmm. The only thing that's happened is we've lost our connection to it, or we've forgotten our connection to it.
Right.
So no matter how progressed our illness, our disease has gotten in relationship to trauma, that innate wisdom is still ticking in the background. And so, yeah, as we start to reconnect to it, it's like almost like, a dry well that just starts to fill up with water.
Yeah.
So, the body, because these patterns, especially within the brain, they're not hardwired, they're soft wired. And so that affords us, I think one of the first phases of healing is just starting to develop psychological safety and trust.
Yeah.
And that's, really the foundation of plasticity to rewire the brain. And really our imagination creates the structure of our brain. So when we have trauma on the brain, we start to just kind of recreate more of the same. And so we start to perpetuate further cycles of harm and wounding, because that's literally what the structure of our brain is. That's the landscape we know. And so healing is helping to introduce the possibility of new landscapes to emerge. And as we restructure our brain, we start to restructure our lives and our physiology and our physical body.
Yeah. So, no, for example, that's what you're saying. No, it's not too late. Beautiful. As long as you're doing this work. And so what does it look like if you could, just the highlights, because, if someone were to come and work with you, and you're saying you're working with the innate healing, what does that look like? Are you doing muscle testing? Are you doing, is it a meditative thing? Is it energy healing? Is it physiological? How does it work?
Yeah. And so, all my work is done remotely now. So I actually speak on the phone with my clients. I see clients nationwide. I work with a combination of trauma and neuroscience, somatics, and mindfulness and energy medicine. I've fused all of these practices together into one comprehensive trauma-informed healing system that I actually also teach and certify healthcare professionals in. And everyone's experience of the work is quite unique, because everyone's body and brain is wired differently. In the traditional model of therapy, often we talk about how some people process top down while other people process bottom up. And so what that means is for some folks, they need the light bulb to go off intellectually before they start to feel something shift and trickle down into the body. And then other people need to feel something shift in the body. And then they can start to grok it intellectually.
Right.
The cool thing with energy medicine is I look at processing is not just top down or bottom up, but it's happening multi-directionally. And so we may be shifting, for example, I had a client come to me for infertility. This was years ago. And she'd already seen all the specialists, the pelvic floor specialists. She had done IVF and just nothing was taking. She had done every type of treatment to strengthen and fortify her reproductive system. Well, when she came to me, again, I'm asking the body what it needs instead of telling it. And her body just brought me to her cranium. And I was just doing a gentle release of the occipital lobe and the cranium and the tissues and the fascia around the skull. Mm-hmm. And then a memory came through when she had a concussion at age 5. And as that memory came up, it flushed through her whole system. We never even worked on her pelvic floor or her reproductive system, but she conceived shortly thereafter. Because again, we weren't trying to, because someone who has they're not able to conceive, they think that there's something wrong with their reproductive system. Well, the reproductive system is part of the entire body, mind, spirit. So there may be something stored or locked elsewhere in the body that's impacting the function of the pelvic floor. And, so as the occipital lobe released, it freed up the pelvic floor. Everyone's different. So with her, I was working somewhere physically on her body, and then that released a memory. And as the memory came to consciousness, it then released emotion, which then had a cascading effect on the rest of her physical body. And so for some people, I will kind of be letting them know where I'm working, and then that'll kind of conjure up some things for them to speak into. And then that'll guide me to work in other parts of the body. Other folks go into a deeply meditative state, and it's like I'm more speaking to the subconscious and the unconscious mind. And then going into that deeply meditative state is where they're finally getting a taste of that regulated nervous system and that calm cardiovascular system and the strengthening of their immune system. And it's like they're just living in connection to that innate wisdom. So the healing is all happening, despite their conscious mind. It's like sometimes we're healing where the conscious mind can't even grasp, these changes in hormones and these shifts in emotions flushing out through the body. So everyone's experience is different. Some people are going to process, I have other clients that are talking the whole time and I'm just working in the background because they're speaking into things that are coming front of mind as we're moving it through the body. And so everyone's experience is really unique. I give one other example because I think it's helpful.
Yeah, they're so helpful.
I had a client who came to me with a football-sized fibroid. And, I said, well, if we work together in a very trauma-informed way, which is honoring your body so we don't overwhelm it, and we titrate the process so we don't bite off more than we can chew, and we help the system process in a really safe, sustainable way, we're going to help your body identify what is stored inside that fibroid. And so through the course of our work together, we helped her body surface a lot of grief from 2 really significant losses in her life. We helped her body start to identify a lot of fear tied into those losses. And then also shame around just a perceived failure in their life. And as we worked through all of that, well, the fibroid shrunk down to less than the size of a baseball. And she was able to let go of a relationship that wasn't really serving her because she was just no longer afraid of loss, which was that grief piece. She started a new business because she was no longer afraid of failure, tied into that shame piece. So it's like these behaviors and her whole life started to take a different form outside. She started to, in her new business, give herself a raise and really, take care of her needs more. Nice. But then the chronic pain that was organized around that fibroid. And at the time when she first came to me, she was deathly afraid of actually having medical treatment because there was medical trauma in the past.
Oh,
but
wow.
Shrunk down. She said, I'm ready to go see the doctor. But by the time she saw the doctor, they said, just keep doing what you're doing because it's working. So let's not treat it medically.
Yeah, that's a great story. And that leads me to the next question. So if you're working with someone How long do you usually work with someone before, is it weekly? Is it a one-time deal? And then the second part of that question is, do they continue the work on their own, or they can continue to come back as though it was acupuncture or chiropractic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I currently work through a 9 or a 12-month program, and I work 3 weeks on and 1 week off. So basically 3 sessions per month for 9 to 12 months. Folks who are coming to me are really looking to get to the bottom of, deeply held patterns of trauma that are creating the anxiety, the depression, the chronic pain, the chronic illness. So it's not an overnight quick fix. Folks are going to start to see relief. I started with a client recently, and her body's not holding all the excess water, and her digestion's already coming back online, and she's already setting new boundaries, and she's starting to grieve some loss. So there's already some pretty significant shifts up front, but we want that to trickle down through the whole body and the nervous system. And so that's a longer journey. I had one client that came to me. I have a psychiatrist that refers patients to me. I help a lot of people with complex trauma and PTSD, who particularly for years through psychiatry have been just medicating, which pain and symptom management is sometimes necessary, but it does little to address the underbelly of the iceberg.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and some folks can't do the deeper healing to address the underbelly of the iceberg unless they're managing pain and symptoms medically. So not an integrative approach, but also let's not grow a dependence on a medication if it's not helping us do some of the deeper healing. But I had one client who came to me, and he had been in traditional talk therapy for 30 years. And again, all about an integrative approach. Talk therapy has been a great complement to my healing. And I love when clients are seeing a talk therapist. But again, there's some pain we can't think or talk our way through when it's stored in the body. Right. And especially my chronic pain clients, talking about pain will activate the sympathetic nervous system and lend it to becoming more chronic. So there's a time and a place for talk therapy. And sometimes it's best to find a different way through. So he said his first 9-month program with me was more effective than 3 decades of talk therapy, because he had a good intellectual understanding of his shame and of his pain, but it did little to release it through the body, which was still causing migraines. And, he was being treated for migraines through his neurologist, treated for the depression through his psychiatrist. And, those medications have, gradually been, he's been weaning off of them.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. We can't really, and I say this as a therapist, sometimes those antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds, if you are unable to function, sure, but I appreciate what you're saying. That's not something that we need to or even should be relying on as a cure long term, because it doesn't. It's really more of a Band-Aid to allow you to get through. When I've worked with patients who just can't do the work we're doing. I'm a holistic psychotherapist, so I do mind, body, spirit work, not just talk therapy, but that's a third of it. And if they're not able to do the work at all, then in order to receive the healing that we are doing, sure. But I appreciate that, no, this isn't the long-term fix. There's deeper work to be done. Yeah.
Well, and, a lot of folks have been bought and sold on the idea that chemical imbalance is what's creating depression or anxiety. And research actually hasn't proven that.
That's right. I read that report.
And, but what if what's beneath chemical imbalance is attachment wounding and unresolved trauma. Yeah. And so chemical imbalance has a pretty great capacity to repair itself when we address the trauma that's beneath it.
Yeah, very well said. So how can people find you, Greg?
Sure. Yeah, gregweiting.com. You can learn more about my one-on-one practice. And I guess to keep answering your question from before, a lot of folks go through a 9-month program and they have gone through a really large arc of transformation. But I actually invite most people who reach out to me to join my program, where I'd rather teach you how to heal yourself. And so I work with clients one-on-one, and then I have the Prisma course and community and training program. And that's a trauma and neuroscience roadmap, which is really the 7 Prisma pillars are the drop pins on that map that help people navigate from pain to purpose. The somatic and mindfulness-based practices, which is really the mind training to reorient from pain to possibility and to drop identification with wounding. And then the energy medicine component, which is really the vehicle for healing that helps us bypass the brain to calm the cardiovascular system and regulate the nervous system and strengthen immune function. So folks can get through the entire curriculum in 3 months, but have 12 months access to continue to repeat the trainings and get the support of the community. And so that's, a really special place for people who want to commit to an arc of transformation and get all the tools and all the support in one place.
Beautiful. And I will have the website addresses for everyone in the show notes so that you can find out how to work with Greg on one of his programs. And Greg Weiting, I just want to thank you so much for being on Self Talk today.
Thanks, Rachel. It's a pleasure.
Hi, this is Rachel Astarte from the Self Talk podcast. I'd love for you to send me your emails with questions or stories about yourself. What are you looking for? What are your questions? What are you grappling with in your own personal life that has to do with your identity, with yourself, with your very existence? These are the things that we're going to talk about during the podcast. And go ahead. It's all right. Get deep. I can handle it. So send them to Rachel@selftalkpodcast.com. And I'll see you on the next episode.